I can fly. 3 words that should never come from an 11-year-old child standing in a commercial airliner's cockpit. But when Captain Morrison collapsed during final approach with 143 passengers aboard, and First Officer Kim struggled alone at the controls, Maya Chen's quiet announcement became their only hope for survival. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun cast golden light through the terminal windows at Denver International Airport as passengers gathered at Gate B-17 for United Flight 2847 to San Francisco. Among the crowd of business travelers checking their phones and families organizing carry-on luggage stood a small figure that drew occasional sympathetic glances from passing adults. 11-year-old Maya Chen waited patiently in the boarding line, her purple backpack decorated with airplane stickers sitting at her feet while she clutched a worn stuffed elephant named Mr. Wings against her chest. Her dark hair was pulled into 2 neat braids, and she wore jeans with a hoodie that had cartoon clouds printed across the front, looking every bit like an ordinary elementary school student traveling alone for the first time. A gate agent named Susan noticed Maya standing quietly and approached with the bright smile adults reserve for children traveling without parents. "Are you excited for your flight, sweetie?" Susan asked in that particular gentle voice people use with young kids. Maya nodded politely, giving a small smile that made her look even younger than her 11 years. "I'm going to visit my aunt in San Francisco," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the airport announcements. Susan checked her computer screen and saw the unaccompanied minor tag on Maya's reservation. "Well, we'll take extra good care of you," Susan promised, attaching a special lanyard around Maya's neck that identified her as a child traveling alone. "The flight attendants will watch over you the whole way, okay?" Maya thanked her quietly, seeming like any other nervous kid about to board an airplane by herself. What nobody at the gate knew, what none of the boarding passengers could possibly guess as they smiled at the small girl with her stuffed animal, was that Maya Chen had spent the last 3 years obsessively studying aviation with an intensity that bordered on devotion. Her father, Captain James Chen, had been a commercial airline pilot for 15 years before a sudden brain aneurysm took his life when Maya was 8 years old. In those final years before his death, he had shared his passion for flying with his daughter in ways that went far beyond typical parent-child bonding. He had brought home flight manuals and let her sit in his lap while he used professional-grade flight simulation software, explaining every switch and dial in the cockpit, teaching her about thrust ratios and glide slopes and the precise dance of landing a massive aircraft safely on a runway. After his death, Maya's grief had transformed into an almost desperate need to connect with her father through the thing he had loved most. Her mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, a physician who worked long hospital shifts, had initially thought her daughter's interest in aviation was just a phase of mourning. She bought Maya a subscription to a sophisticated flight simulator program, thinking the child would play with it for a few weeks before moving on to other interests. Instead, Maya had thrown herself into learning everything about flying with a focus that astonished even the online flight simulation communities she quietly joined. Using a fake birth date that made her appear older, she participated in forums where real pilots and aviation enthusiasts discussed technical procedures. She watched hundreds of hours of cockpit recordings, studied emergency procedure manuals she found in her father's old files, and practiced landing scenarios thousands of times on her simulator, always choosing the hardest weather conditions and most challenging airports. Her bedroom had become a shrine to aviation knowledge. The walls were covered with charts showing different types of aircraft, diagrams of cockpit layouts, and printouts of approach plates for major airports around the world. Her bookshelf held thick manuals on aerodynamics, weather theory, and aircraft systems that most adults would find impossibly technical. Every night before bed, Maya would spend at least 2 hours in her simulator, practicing approaches to different runways, rehearsing emergency procedures, memorizing the specific speeds and configurations for various phases of flight. Her mother would sometimes stand in the doorway watching her daughter's intense concentration, feeling a mixture of concern and amazement at the dedication Maya showed to mastering something so complex. Now, as she boarded Flight 2847 with the other passengers, Maya looked around the Boeing 737 cabin with eyes that saw details others missed. She noticed the slightly worn carpeting in the aisle that indicated this aircraft was probably 7 or 8 years old based on the interior design. She observed the flight attendants performing their pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, noting which emergency exits they paid extra attention to and which ones received only cursory glances. As a flight attendant named Jennifer guided Maya to her seat in row 12 by the window, Maya's gaze lingered on the cockpit door standing open during boarding, catching a glimpse of the pilots running through their pre-flight checklist. She could see the captain's hands moving across the overhead panel, checking switches and confirming settings, following the same systematic process her father had demonstrated to her countless times. "Here's your seat, honey," Jennifer said cheerfully, helping Maya store her backpack in the overhead compartment while making sure she kept Mr. Wings with her. "Have you flown by yourself before?" Maya shook her head, playing the role of the nervous young passenger perfectly. "Well, it's very safe," Jennifer assured her with a warm smile. "Captain Morrison has been flying for 25 years, and First Officer Rachel Kim is wonderful too. They'll get you to San Francisco smoothly, I promise. If you need anything at all during the flight, you just press this button right here, okay?" She showed Maya the call button, treating her exactly like what she appeared to be, just another child who needed extra reassurance and supervision. As other passengers filed past, several smiled at Maya or made brief comments about how brave she was to fly alone. An elderly woman in the aisle seat patted her hand gently and said, "My granddaughter is about your age. What grade are you in, dear?" Maya answered politely that she was in 6th grade, maintaining the appearance of a typical preteen with typical interests. A businessman across the aisle asked if she was excited about her trip, and Maya gave him the small nervous smile that adults expected from children in unfamiliar situations. Nobody looked at this quiet 11-year-old girl and imagined that she could name every instrument in the cockpit, explain the difference between ILS and visual approaches, or describe the exact procedures for recovering from a stalled engine during landing. The aircraft pushed back from the gate right on schedule at 9:15 in the morning. Maya felt the familiar sensation of movement as the tug pulled them away from the terminal, then the slight lurch as the pilots released the parking brake and began taxiing under the plane's own power. She looked out her window at the massive Denver landscape, watching other aircraft moving along the taxiways like a carefully choreographed ballet. In her mind, she could picture exactly what the pilots were doing right now, calling ground control for taxi clearance, checking their instruments one final time, reviewing the takeoff performance numbers based on the aircraft's weight and the weather conditions. The takeoff was smooth and unremarkable, the kind of routine departure that happens thousands of times every day across the country's commercial aviation system. Maya felt the surge of acceleration as the engines powered up, the moment when the nose wheel lifted off the ground, then the gentle climb as Denver fell away beneath them and the Rocky Mountains stretched out in magnificent detail below. Jennifer came by once they reached cruising altitude to bring Maya a ginger ale and a package of cookies, asking if she was doing okay and reminding her again that she could call for help anytime. Maya thanked her politely, sipping her drink while watching the clouds drift past her window, looking like any other child on an airplane passing the time during a flight. The flight progressed normally for the next hour and 45 minutes as they crossed the mountain ranges and desert landscapes of the American West. Maya pulled out a tablet from her backpack and appeared to be playing games or watching videos, which was exactly what the adults around her expected an 11-year-old to do during a flight. What they couldn't see was that she was actually reviewing aviation weather reports for the San Francisco Bay Area, checking the current winds and visibility conditions at their destination airport, noting that there was a moderate crosswind but nothing problematic for an experienced crew. She studied the airport diagram, reviewing the layout of the runways and taxiways, preparing mentally for their arrival even though she had no reason to believe she would need this information. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Morrison and First Officer Rachel Kim were managing the flight with the casual efficiency that came from years of experience. Morrison was 53 years old, a veteran pilot who had logged over 18,000 flight hours during his career. He had 2 daughters of his own in college and often thought about passengers like the young girl traveling alone in row 12, making sure his flights were especially smooth when he knew there were nervous children aboard. He and Rachel had been discussing the approach into San Francisco, reviewing the latest weather updates and confirming which runway they would be using for landing. Their conversation was relaxed, professional, touching on technical details mixed with casual chat about their families and weekend plans. What Captain Morrison didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have detected during his pre-flight medical check or noticed during the smooth flight, was that a time bomb was ticking inside his cardiovascular system. A small arterial plaque in his coronary artery had been building silently for months, narrowing the blood flow to his heart incrementally without causing noticeable symptoms. The FAA's medical certification process was thorough, but some conditions slipped through even the most careful examinations. Morrison had passed his last flight physical 3 months earlier with no concerning findings, and he felt perfectly healthy as he guided the Boeing 737 westward toward California. As they began their descent toward San Francisco, passing through 35,000 feet with the Pacific coastline becoming visible in the distance, Morrison felt a strange tightness in his chest. He dismissed it initially as indigestion from the coffee he'd drunk earlier, shifting in his seat and taking a deep breath. Rachel was handling the radio communications with air traffic control, acknowledging their clearance to descend to 15,000 feet and reviewing the approach procedures they would use for landing on runway 28L at San Francisco International Airport. The descent felt routine, the aircraft responding smoothly to their inputs as they began the gradual journey down from cruising altitude toward the ground below. Maya noticed the change in engine sound as the pilots reduced thrust and began the descent. She could feel the slight forward tilt of the aircraft and the subtle pop in her ears as the cabin pressure adjusted. In her mind, she pictured the pilots running through their descent checklist, verifying that all systems were functioning properly, confirming the approach frequencies were set correctly in their navigation radios. She had practiced this exact scenario hundreds of times in her simulator, approaching San Francisco from the east, managing the descent rate to arrive at the appropriate altitudes at specific waypoints along the arrival route. Captain Morrison's chest tightness was getting worse. A sensation of pressure was building behind his sternum, radiating into his left arm in a way that triggered his medical training's warning bells. He had just opened his mouth to tell Rachel that he wasn't feeling well when the arterial plaque that had been silently narrowing his coronary artery suddenly ruptured completely. The massive heart attack hit him like a physical blow. His vision tunneled, his left arm went numb, and excruciating pain exploded through his chest. He gasped, clutching at his shirt front, his face going pale and sweaty within seconds. "Robert." Rachel's voice was sharp with alarm as she saw her captain suddenly slump forward against his harness, his hands falling away from the controls. "Robert, talk to me." But Morrison couldn't respond. His eyes had rolled back slightly, his breathing becoming shallow and labored as his body went into shock from the cardiac event. The aircraft continued its descent smoothly on autopilot, but they were now at 12,000 feet and descending toward one of the busiest airports in the country with only one pilot conscious in the cockpit. Rachel's training kicked in immediately despite the shock and fear flooding her system. She grabbed the radio. "San Francisco approach, United 2847, we have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Captain is incapacitated. Requesting priority handling." Her voice was steady but tight with stress as she simultaneously tried to check Morrison's condition while keeping the aircraft under control. The air traffic controller's response was immediate and professional. "United 2847, Roger. You have priority clearance. Medical personnel will be standing by. Continue approach runway 28L, altimeter 29907. In the cabin, passengers were still relaxed, most of them unaware that anything was wrong. But Jennifer, the lead flight attendant, had heard the urgency in Rachel's voice over the intercom when she called back to report the situation. Jennifer's face went pale as she absorbed the information. A captain collapsed during the approach, they needed any medical professionals on board immediately, and they needed them now. She grabbed the public address microphone with shaking hands, trying to keep her voice calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical situation on board. If there are any doctors, nurses, or medical professionals on this flight, please identify yourselves immediately by pressing your call button." 3 call buttons lit up almost simultaneously. 2 doctors and a nurse quickly made their way forward as confused murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers began looking around nervously, trying to understand what was happening. Jennifer was already opening the cockpit door, and Maya, still sitting quietly in row 12, felt her heart rate accelerate as she realized something serious was occurring. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, trying to see toward the front of the aircraft where the commotion was centered. The elderly woman next to her put a gentle hand on Maya's arm. "Sit down, sweetheart. I'm sure everything is fine. The adults will handle whatever's happening." But Maya barely heard her. She was staring toward the cockpit, her mind racing through possibilities. A medical emergency serious enough to require doctors, during the approach phase, which meant they were probably between 10 and 15,000 feet based on how long they'd been descending. That meant maybe 12 to 15 minutes from landing, possibly less. If a pilot was incapacitated, the other pilot would be flying alone, managing communications, navigating, and preparing for landing all simultaneously while dealing with the stress of the emergency. One of the doctors, a cardiologist named Dr. Stephen Park, squeezed into the cramped cockpit and immediately recognized the signs of a massive cardiac event. Morrison was barely conscious, his vital signs dangerously unstable. "He needs immediate advanced care," Dr. Park said grimly to Rachel, who was trying to fly the aircraft while glancing desperately at her collapsed captain. "Is there any chance we can land sooner? He needs a hospital now." Rachel's hands were tight on the controls, her training warring with her panic. She was a competent first officer with 3,000 hours of flight time, but she had never landed an aircraft completely alone during an actual emergency. Morrison had always been there, the experienced captain providing backup and guidance. Now she was solely responsible for bringing this aircraft down safely with 143 passengers and 5 crew members depending entirely on her skills. "We're cleared for straight-in approach," she said, her voice strained. "I need everyone out of the cockpit except medical personnel. I have to focus on flying." But as Dr. Park worked to stabilize Morrison in the cramped space, his body partially blocking Rachel's access to certain controls, and as the altimeter wound down through 8,000 feet with the ground rising up to meet them, Rachel felt something she had never experienced before in an aircraft. Pure, overwhelming doubt. Her hands were trembling slightly on the controls. The aircraft was descending too fast, she realized. She had been so focused on the emergency that she had let their descent rate increase beyond normal parameters. She pulled back on the throttles and adjusted the pitch, but her movements were jerky, uncertain. Sweat was forming on her forehead as she tried to remember all the procedures, tried to focus on the approach while her captain lay collapsed beside her. In the cabin, Maya had moved forward several rows, her small size allowing her to slip past the confused and frightened passengers more easily than an adult could have. She reached the area near the galley where Jennifer and another flight attendant were trying to maintain some order while passengers demanded to know what was happening. Maya could see partially into the cockpit, could see the slumped figure of the captain and the doctor working on him, could see the first officer's stressed posture as she struggled with the controls. "Sweetie, you need to go back to your seat," Jennifer said when she noticed Maya, her voice distracted as she dealt with increasingly anxious passengers. "We're going to land soon, and it's not safe for you to be standing." Maya looked at Jennifer with an intensity that seemed strange in such a young face. "What happened to the pilot?" she asked quietly. Jennifer hesitated, not wanting to frighten the child but also too stressed to come up with a comforting lie. "He's very sick, honey, but the other pilot is perfectly capable of landing the plane. Now please go sit down." But Maya didn't move. She was listening to the sounds of the aircraft, feeling the slight wallowing in the controls that suggested the first officer was overcorrecting, making small mistakes that individually weren't dangerous but collectively indicated someone who was struggling. Maya had felt these same sensations in her simulator when she first started practicing approaches, before she learned to make smoother, more confident control inputs. They were now passing through 6,000 feet, maybe 10 minutes from touchdown, entering the phase where precision became absolutely critical. Rachel's voice came over the public address system, tight with stress but trying to sound reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Kim. We've had a medical emergency with Captain Morrison, but I want to assure you that I am fully qualified to land this aircraft. We'll be on the ground in San Francisco in approximately 8 minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and remain calm." But her voice lacked the complete confidence that passengers wanted to hear in that moment, and anxious conversations erupted throughout the cabin. Some passengers were gripping their armrests, others were reaching for their phones to send messages to loved ones, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. Maya made a decision that seemed insane, that went against every social norm about children obeying adults and staying out of grown-up situations. She pushed past Jennifer with surprising determination and moved toward the cockpit door. "Honey, no." Jennifer reached for her, but Maya was already stepping into the cockpit entrance, her small frame easily fitting through the narrow space where Dr. Park was working on Morrison. "I can fly," Maya said quietly but clearly, her young voice cutting through the controlled chaos in the tiny cockpit. Rachel's head snapped around, her face showing complete confusion as she stared at this 11-year-old child standing in her cockpit doorway. "What? Get out of here. Jennifer, get this child back to her seat." But Maya didn't move. She looked directly at Rachel with eyes that held something far more serious than a child's gaze should contain. "You're descending too fast," Maya said calmly, glancing at the instruments she could see from her position. "Your vertical speed is 1,800 feet per minute at this altitude and airspeed. It should be closer to 1,200 for a stable approach. Your airspeed is also high, 195 knots when you should be starting to slow to 170 for this distance from the runway." Rachel stared at the child in complete shock. The numbers Maya had quoted were exactly correct, information that no 11-year-old should possibly know, let alone be able to assess in the middle of a crisis. "How do you?" Rachel began, but another alarm chimed in the cockpit, the terrain awareness system warning that their descent rate was too high for their proximity to the ground. "My father was Captain James Chen," Maya said quickly, urgently. "He flew for United for 15 years. He taught me to fly before he died. I've practiced landing procedures thousands of times on professional-grade simulators. I know the approach speeds for a 737, I know the landing configuration settings, I know the emergency procedures." She was speaking fast, trying to convey credibility while Rachel's attention was divided between this impossible situation and the rapidly approaching ground showing on her navigation display. Dr. Park looked up from where he was performing chest compressions on Morrison, his face showing complete disbelief. "She's a child," he said to Rachel. "You can't possibly consider." But Rachel was looking at Maya with a desperate calculation forming behind her stressed expression. She was alone in this cockpit, trying to manage multiple tasks simultaneously, making mistakes because she was overwhelmed and frightened. The approach was deteriorating, and she knew it. She needed help, needed someone who could assist with the workload, who could call out altitudes and speeds and provide another set of eyes on the instruments. The idea of accepting help from an 11-year-old was insane, violated every instinct and regulation about cockpit operations. But there was something in this child's eyes, in the precise technical language she had used, in the calm confidence of her posture that was completely incongruous with her age. "The flap position for your current speed," Maya continued, seeing Rachel's hesitation as a possible opening. "You have flaps at 5 degrees. At 170 knots you should extend to 15 degrees to increase lift and allow steeper descent without building excessive airspeed. When you slow to 150 knots, flaps to 30 degrees for final approach configuration." She was reciting information she had memorized from her father's training manuals, from hundreds of hours studying the exact procedures for flying this specific aircraft type. Rachel made a decision that was either brilliant or completely reckless. "Stay there," she ordered Maya curtly. "Don't touch anything. But tell me the approach speeds for landing weight." She was testing the child, seeing if this impossible knowledge was real or some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Maya didn't hesitate. Landing weight for a 737-800 is typically between 120 and 140,000 pounds depending on fuel and passenger load. For 130,000 pounds, target approach speed is 143 knots, final approach speed is 138 knots, threshold speed is 133 knots with a touchdown target of 128 knots. The numbers were exactly right, within 1 or 2 knots of the precise values Rachel had calculated during her approach briefing. No child should know this information. It was impossible. But Maya had just demonstrated knowledge that was completely accurate. Rachel's hands were still shaking on the controls as they descended through 4,000 feet, the San Francisco Bay filling the windscreen ahead with the airport still several miles in the distance. "Jennifer," Rachel called back through the cockpit door, her voice strained with disbelief at what she was about to say. "This child stays in the cockpit. She's going to assist me with the approach." Jennifer's face appeared in the doorway, her expression showing complete incomprehension. "Rachel, she's 11 years old. This is insane." "I know," Rachel replied, fighting to keep her voice steady as she adjusted their descent rate, following Maya's guidance and reducing the vertical speed to something more appropriate. "But I need help, and she knows what she's talking about. Keep the passengers calm. We're landing in 6 minutes." Maya moved carefully past Dr. Park into the small space beside the center console where she could see all the instruments clearly. She was too short to reach the controls even if she had wanted to, but from this position she could monitor the displays and provide information to Rachel, acting as an impromptu co-pilot in a situation that would have been unbelievable if it weren't actually happening. "Current altitude 3,200 feet, Maya said, her voice remarkably calm for a child in such an intense situation. "Distance to runway threshold 6.3 miles. Descent rate is good now at 1,000 feet per minute. Airspeed 178 knots, coming down." Rachel was following the instrument landing system guidance, the needles on her display showing whether they were above or below the correct glide path and left or right of the runway centerline. But having Maya call out the numbers, providing confirmation of their position and status, was helping Rachel manage the overwhelming workload of flying alone during an emergency. "Gear down," Rachel said, moving the landing gear lever. They all felt the slight drag as the massive wheels extended into the airstream below the aircraft. 3 green lights, gear down and locked, Maya confirmed, checking the indicator lights that showed each landing gear was properly extended and secured. This was information Rachel could see herself, but having it called out following standard crew procedures was helping Rachel's stressed mind process the approach more systematically. They were descending through 2,000 feet now, the ground rising up to meet them with the airport clearly visible ahead. "Flaps 15, Rachel ordered herself, extending the wing flaps to increase lift and allow a steeper approach angle. Maya watched the flap indicator move to the 15-degree position and called out, "Flaps 15, on speed." Rachel's hands on the controls were becoming steadier, her breathing more controlled as she fell into the familiar rhythm of an approach, even though her co-pilot was an elementary school child and her captain lay unconscious beside her. In the cabin, passengers could feel the aircraft slowing and descending, could hear the gear extending and the flaps moving, all the normal sensations of an approach to landing. But they could also sense the tension from the flight attendants, could see Jennifer and her crew members braced near their stations with expressions of barely controlled fear. Some passengers were praying quietly, others were holding hands with strangers, all of them aware that something was seriously wrong even if they didn't understand the full scope of the crisis in the cockpit. 1,000 feet above field elevation, Maya called out as they descended through 1,600 feet on the altimeter. San Francisco International Airport was spread out below them now, the long runways stretching out like gray ribbons against the bay waters. Rachel could see the runway they were aiming for, 28L, one of the longest runways at the airport but still requiring precision to land safely on a strip that was 50 feet wide and 11,000 feet long. Any commercial pilot could land on that runway in normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. "Flaps 30, landing checklist," Rachel said, her voice showing strain but also increasing focus as the approach continued. Maya scanned the instruments, looking for anything abnormal, any warning lights or incorrect settings that might indicate a problem. "Flaps moving to 30, Maya confirmed. Landing gear down and locked, 3 green lights. Spoilers armed. Auto brake set to 3. She was reading off the configuration items that should be completed before landing, items that Rachel had set but that needed verification. They were passing through 1,000 feet above the ground now, less than 2 minutes from touchdown. This was the phase where absolutely everything had to be perfect, where any mistakes could turn fatal in seconds. Rachel's hands were making small adjustments to the throttles and control yoke, keeping the aircraft aligned with the runway centerline, maintaining the proper descent rate. But Maya could see her over-controlling slightly, making inputs that were a bit too aggressive and then having to correct in the opposite direction. Smooth inputs, Maya said quietly, remembering her father's voice saying the same thing to her countless times during simulator sessions. Small corrections, let the aircraft stabilize between adjustments. It was advice that came from thousands of hours of flying experience, delivered in the voice of a child who had never actually flown a real aircraft but who had absorbed her father's knowledge like a sponge. Rachel took a breath and consciously relaxed her grip slightly, making her control movements more subtle. The aircraft's flight path smoothed out, the instruments showing a perfect approach angle and speed. 500 feet, Maya called out, watching the radio altimeter that showed their exact height above the ground. The runway was filling the windscreen now, the threshold markers clearly visible as they descended on the glide slope. Airspeed 138 knots, on target. Descent rate 700 feet per minute, glide path centered. 300 feet. Maya was calling out the critical parameters exactly as a real co-pilot would, providing the pilot flying with essential information without cluttering the communication with unnecessary words. Rachel's eyes were locked on the runway, her entire being focused on the final moments of the approach. The ground proximity warning system began its automatic altitude callouts. 200 feet. 100 feet. They were seconds from touchdown now, the aircraft passing over the runway threshold at exactly the right height and speed. Rachel began the flare maneuver, gently pulling back on the control yoke to raise the nose slightly and reduce their descent rate for a smooth touchdown. 50 feet. 40. 30. 20. 10. The main landing gear touched the runway with a slight chirp of rubber on concrete, not the smoothest landing Rachel had ever made but perfectly acceptable given the circumstances. She pulled the throttles to idle and deployed the speed brakes, felt the nose gear settle onto the runway as she applied gentle pressure to the brakes. The thrust reversers deployed with their characteristic roar, helping slow the massive aircraft. Thrust reversers deployed, Maya said, watching the indicators. Speed brakes up. Braking good. The aircraft decelerated smoothly down the long runway, slowing from touchdown speed to a manageable taxi speed as emergency vehicles with flashing lights raced alongside them on the parallel taxiways. Rachel's hands were shaking violently now as the adrenaline of the last few minutes caught up with her. She had landed the aircraft. They were safe on the ground. Captain Morrison was still receiving CPR from Dr. Park, but medical personnel would reach him in seconds. The passengers were safe. This impossible, terrifying situation had somehow resulted in survival. "We're down," Rachel said, her voice breaking with relief and exhaustion. She turned the aircraft off the runway onto a taxiway where she stopped and set the parking brake, unable to go further as her hands trembled too much to control the aircraft precisely. Emergency personnel were already surrounding them, medical teams rushing toward the aircraft with equipment to treat Morrison. Maya stepped back from the center console, suddenly aware of how strange this situation was, how impossible it would be to explain what had just happened. Rachel turned to look at her, this 11-year-old child who had just helped land a commercial aircraft during one of the most dangerous situations a pilot could face. "Who are you?" Rachel whispered, staring at Maya with an expression that mixed gratitude, disbelief, and shock. "My name is Maya Chen," the girl said softly, suddenly looking very young and very tired. "My dad was Captain James Chen. He died 3 years ago, but before he did, he taught me everything he could about flying. He said that knowing how to fly meant understanding how to stay calm when things go wrong, how to focus on solutions instead of panicking, how to trust in training and procedures even when you're scared. He told me that flying was about more than just moving an aircraft through the air. It was about being responsible for everyone who trusted you to get them safely from one place to another. Rachel's eyes were filling with tears as she looked at this child who had just demonstrated courage and knowledge far beyond her years. The cockpit door opened and paramedics rushed in to attend to Captain Morrison, carefully extracting him from his seat and beginning advanced cardiac care even as they prepared to transport him to the hospital. Jennifer appeared in the doorway, her face showing complete confusion as she looked between Rachel and Maya, trying to understand how this child had ended up in the cockpit during the landing. The passengers were being evacuated down emergency slides as a precaution, the normal procedure when an aircraft stops on a taxiway with a medical emergency. Maya could hear the sounds of organized chaos outside as people slid down the inflatable ramps to the ground where buses waited to transport them to the terminal. Fire trucks surrounded the aircraft, emergency personnel everywhere ensuring there were no other problems beyond the medical situation with Morrison. An airline supervisor climbed into the cockpit, his face showing complete bafflement as he looked at Maya standing beside Rachel. "What is a child doing in the cockpit?" he demanded, his tone suggesting he thought this was some kind of security breach. Rachel turned to him with a look that was both exhausted and fiercely protective. "This child helped save everyone on this aircraft," she said firmly. "Captain Morrison collapsed during our approach. I was alone and overwhelmed. Maya provided critical assistance with the approach and landing. Without her help, I don't know if I could have brought us down safely." The supervisor stared at Rachel as if she had lost her mind, then looked at Maya with an expression of complete incomprehension. There would be investigations, reviews, reports filed with the FAA and NTSB, questions about how a child ended up assisting with an emergency landing in violation of every regulation governing cockpit access and crew qualifications. But in that moment, none of the bureaucratic consequences mattered compared to the simple truth that everyone had survived. Maya was led off the aircraft by Jennifer, who held her hand tightly as they evacuated down one of the emergency slides. They landed on the soft ground beside the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles and personnel. Maya looked back at the aircraft sitting on the taxiway, its doors still open with paramedics working to stabilize Captain Morrison inside. She thought about her father, about all the hours he had spent teaching her, about how he had always said that flying was as much about mental preparation as physical skill. She had never imagined those lessons would matter in such a dramatic way, had never thought she would actually use her knowledge in a real emergency. The passengers were being gathered together and accounted for, airline personnel moving through the crowd with clipboards checking that everyone had evacuated safely. Maya stood quietly with Jennifer, feeling very small among all the adults and commotion. Some of the passengers who had seen her in the cabin were pointing and talking, confused about why such a young girl had been in the cockpit during the landing. The elderly woman who had been sitting next to Maya approached, her face showing concern. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked gently, not understanding what Maya had been doing in the cockpit but seeing that the child looked shaken. News crews were already arriving at the airport, alerted by emergency radio traffic about the medical emergency and dramatic landing. Within hours, the story would be broadcast worldwide. A commercial airline pilot collapsed during final approach, his first officer forced to land alone, and somehow an 11-year-old passenger ended up in the cockpit providing assistance. It was the kind of story that seemed too incredible to be true, that would generate intense debate about regulations and safety procedures and whether what had happened should be classified as a miracle or a dangerous breach of protocol. Maya was taken to a quiet room in the terminal where airline officials and airport security personnel gathered to understand what had happened. Her mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, was contacted immediately and raced to the airport from her hospital shift, arriving to find her daughter sitting calmly in a conference room surrounded by adults asking questions. Lisa's face showed terror mixed with relief as she rushed to Maya and pulled her into a tight embrace. "What happened?" Lisa demanded, looking at the airline officials. "Why was my daughter involved in a cockpit emergency?" They explained the situation as best they could, how Captain Morrison had collapsed, how First Officer Kim had been overwhelmed, how Maya had entered the cockpit and demonstrated knowledge of aviation procedures that had assisted with the landing. Lisa stared at her daughter with an expression of dawning understanding mixed with shock. She had known Maya was obsessed with her flight simulator, had known her daughter spent hours studying aviation materials, but she had never imagined the depth of knowledge Maya had acquired or that it would ever be tested in such a dramatic way. "Your father would be so proud," Lisa whispered to Maya, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter close. "And so terrified. What you did was incredibly dangerous, Maya. You shouldn't have been in that cockpit." But even as she said it, Lisa understood that her daughter's actions had potentially helped save over 100 lives. It was impossible to be angry about that, even though the mother in her was horrified at the risk Maya had taken. Rachel Kim appeared in the doorway of the conference room, still in her uniform, her face showing exhaustion but also a need to see Maya one more time. "I wanted to thank you," Rachel said quietly, kneeling down to Maya's eye level. "What you did today was extraordinary. I was struggling, making mistakes, and your help gave me the focus I needed to bring everyone down safely. I don't know how to explain what happened in that cockpit, but I know that you made a difference." Maya looked at Rachel with her serious young eyes. "My dad always said that flying is a team effort," she said softly. "He said that the best pilots are the ones who can accept help when they need it and offer help when others are struggling. You were an amazing pilot today. You stayed calm even when everything was going wrong. You trusted me even though it didn't make any sense. That took more courage than anything I did." The investigation that followed would take months, involving detailed reviews of the cockpit voice recorder, flight data recorder, and interviews with everyone involved. The FAA would ultimately determine that while Maya's presence in the cockpit violated numerous regulations, the unique circumstances of the emergency and the positive outcome meant that no punitive actions would be taken against First Officer Kim for accepting the child's assistance. Captain Morrison survived his heart attack thanks to the rapid medical intervention, though he would never fly again. He would later meet Maya and thank her personally, seeing in her the same passion for aviation that had driven his own career. Maya's story would become famous in aviation circles, debated in pilot forums and flight schools as an example of how knowledge and preparation can matter in unexpected ways. Some argued that her involvement was reckless and set a dangerous precedent. Others pointed out that unconventional solutions are sometimes necessary in unprecedented emergencies. For Maya herself, life would gradually return to something approaching normal, though she would never be just an ordinary 11-year-old again. Her classmates at school would treat her like a celebrity for a while before eventually moving on to other interests. But Maya would carry with her the knowledge that she had faced something extraordinary and found strength she didn't know she possessed. Dr. Lisa Chen would make the difficult decision to limit Maya's simulator time, worried that her daughter's obsession with aviation had crossed from healthy interest into something potentially problematic for a child so young. They would attend family counseling together, working through the complicated emotions surrounding Captain James Chen's death. But Lisa would also recognize that her daughter had a genuine gift and passion that shouldn't be completely suppressed. They would compromise, agreeing that Maya could continue studying aviation but in more age-appropriate ways. The elderly woman who had been sitting next to Maya on Flight 2847, whose name was Margaret Foster, would write a letter to the airline describing what she had witnessed. She wrote about watching a quiet, polite child sitting with her stuffed elephant, looking like she needed protection and guidance, and then learning that this same child had helped land their aircraft during a crisis. Margaret's letter would become part of the documentation of that extraordinary day. Rachel Kim would transition from flying to aviation safety instruction, finding that teaching new pilots was more fulfilling than she had expected. In her classes, she would emphasize the importance of recognizing when you're overwhelmed and being willing to accept help from unexpected sources. Years later, Maya would pursue aeronautical engineering, discovering that her real passion wasn't flying aircraft but designing them and improving their safety systems. She would approach her studies with the same intensity she had once brought to flight simulation, but with a more balanced perspective about the role aviation would play in her life. The story of Flight 2847 would endure as a reminder that crisis situations rarely follow predictable patterns, that capability can exist in unexpected forms, and that preparation for events you never expect to face is still worthwhile. Most importantly, it would stand as testimony to human adaptability, to the capacity of people under extreme pressure to make unconventional choices that ultimately served the goal that mattered most, bringing everyone safely home. Maya Chen's quiet announcement in that cockpit, those 3 simple words, "I can fly," would become part of aviation history, not because a child could operate an aircraft, but because in a moment of crisis, knowledge, courage, and compassion came together in the most unexpected way to save lives.